On the southern edge of Parliament Square lies Westminster Abbey, an institution central to the British establishment. The site has been home to the coronation of every monarch since William the Conqueror in 1066. It is the burial place of over 3,000 very prominent Britons, monarchs, prime ministers, scientists, from Queen Elizabeth I to Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, David Livingstone, and the host of memorials to many more: Jane Austen, Sir Francis Drake, Winston Churchill. Then, above the great Western Gate, between its two distinctive towers, Westminster Abbey displays, most prominently, 10 statues dedicated to Christian martyrs of the 20th century. Among them is Martin Luther King, whose assassination in 1968 sparked powerful protests right across the United States, which served as an important wake-up call to many Americans as to the importance of the civil rights movement. Another of these statues, you may be surprised to hear, is that of a South African, a young Bapedi girl called Masemola. Her story, like so many in South Africa, is tough to digest. Her death ultimately the tragic outcome of a clash between two cultures. Manche had been born in Gamarishan, in Sekhukhune in about 1913. That region had been the traditional home of the Bapedi, a Sotho people who once spanned a large territory across the Transvaal, and much of whose traumatic history, a fascinating story by its own right, was still in living memory when Manche Masemola was born. This is important. King Sekhukhune had maneuvered himself into power in 1861, by which time the Bapedi had already had several skirmishes with the Boer trekkers who had entered that region one generation before following their great trek from the Cape. Sekhukhune would over time develop a powerful mountain citadel, while many of his men were armed with guns funded by their labor on the rising mines. As such, invasion would be extremely challenging, as the Boers would learn in 1876 when they were repelled, notwithstanding several attempts. Indeed, the inability of the Boers to pacify that region would be cited by the British as one of the primary reasons for stepping in 1 year later and assuming control over the Greater Transvaal Republic. And with the British now running Pretoria, they believed, incorrectly, that Sekhukhune land was part of their jurisdiction, a difference in opinion which the British tried to rectify by force in 1878. The result, predictably unchanged, for the Bapedi people remained resolute. A further 2 attempts in 1878 also failed, by which time the Anglo-Zulu Wars now drew British attention away from Sekhukhune land. However, with Ulundi secured in July 1879, the British again turned their attention to controlling Sekhukhune. This time, the British realized the magnitude of the challenge. Accordingly, they assembled a significant combined force of Boers, British, and Swati, which finally saw Sekhukhune captured in December of 1879 and led off to a Pretoria jail. There he remained until the Boers removed the British from the Transvaal following that Battle of Mayuba. All the while, Christian missionaries had been attempting to enter that region. As you may well imagine, given this constant friction, this had not been a conducive environment, and as a result, missionaries were understandably viewed by the community with much suspicion. Notwithstanding, the chief at Gamarishan had tolerated missionaries in his region, and while he himself did not convert, Father Augustine Moeka took the opportunity to set up his mission station there in 1919. Here, Moeka's preaching would draw interest from a young Manche Masemola and her cousin Lucia. Intrigued, they wished to hear more, and they began to attend his classes twice a week. Now, given the greater context, it is not surprising that much of the community, including Manche's own parents, were uncomfortable with this development. Here were their children, Manche was just 14 years old, being drawn towards a new and foreign faith, belonging to hostile peoples, and which, by implication, would draw them away from their traditional African spirituality. Manche was discouraged, then warned, even beaten. In realizing the growing danger, she confided to both Lucia and Father Moeka that her life was under threat. Sadly, it proved to be a sound prophecy. There are conflicting reports on the details that follow, but on February the 4th, 1928, young Manche Masemola was dead, killed for her faith as she prepared for baptism. She was buried on a hillside next to a prominent granite rock. Her father later planted euphorbia trees beside the grave in remembrance. A tragic story. Even so, given the remoteness of the location, one could easily expect this story to have been lost to Mother Time. That was not to be. For 7 years later, in 1935, a small group of Christians made a pilgrimage to her gravesite beside that granite rock. Another followed 6 years later in 1941, and then another in 1949. There was something in this story, a spark which was keeping it alive. Indeed, Manche's mother would herself be baptized over 40 years later in 1969. Still, the legend of Manche Masemola lived on. More and more Christians began to join what became and remains to this day an annual August pilgrimage to her grave. In 1975, the Anglican Church of Southern Africa began commemorating Manche Masemola on its calendar of saints on the 4th of February each year. Her statue was unveiled at Westminster Abbey in 1998. A haunting, complex story now set in stone.